I'm a little yeasty, short and stout. There are other beasties hanging out. Feed us every day and discard may grow. Keep us on the counter where the warm winds blow. Feed us once a week for a slower pace. Store us in the fridge in a cooler place. Feed us cold and slow and away we go. Sleeping in the fridge down below. I actually do write children's stories. And what this does, I'm hoping, it gets the point across that the little yeasties and the little beasties are hanging out, and if you feed them every day, discard may grow. You keep them on the counter where the warm winds blow. That's your warm state, and you can work like that every day if that works for you. But if you want a slower pace, keep it in the fridge. Take what you need once a week, replace it, put the starter back in the fridge. I'm not getting into the names of the microbes or the types of yeast. You don't have to know everything to bake sourdough, but I do want to give you some historical context. Historically, bakers used more than one type of fermentation to make bread rise. Some maintained sourdough starters, some used old dough from a previous bake, others collected barm or brewer's yeast from beer making. The fermentation process created the active ingredient that entered the dough. That's why I separate fermentation from the bread making process itself. And let me clarify here. That's why I separate fermentation of the starter and the levain from the bread making process itself, because we are making an ingredient. Historical and modern fermentation starter systems. I'm just going to list them. Sourdough starter is a maintained culture of wild yeast and bacteria. Levain, a portion built from a starter specifically for a bake. It was separated for the mother, and now you have a junior. Barm, foam or yeast-rich froth collected from brewing beer or ale. Brewer's yeast, yeast gathered from fermentation during brewing. Old dough or pâté fermenté, a piece of fermented dough saved from a previous batch and added to a new one. Sponge, a pre-ferment made with flour, water, and yeast before mixing the final dough. I've used this method. Poolish, a wet pre-fermented... Poolish, a wet pre-ferment, traditionally equal parts flour and water with yeast. Biga, a firmer Italian-style pre-ferment with lower hydration than poolish. Yeast cakes. This is what folks back in the 20s and the 30s would have used, blocks of cultivated commercial yeast before modern dry yeast. And now, commercial yeast, baker's yeast, cultivated yeast sold as active dry, instant, or fresh yeast. So, natural fermentation, which is where we are right now, talking about sourdough. But bread making is a bigger process. And that's why I wanted to specifically point out we're taking the fermentation of the sourdough starter and the creation of the levain out of the bread making process, because in future I will be talking about different types of making bread too. So let's talk about the starter. I'm hoping not to make this complicated, because we will be talking about sourdough as a whole process in the future. But right now, we're cleaning up the language so that you understand when I say fermentation, where in the bigger scheme of things, we are in the full line of fermentation activation for sourdough bread. What is a starter? A starter is your permanent culture. Your starter is the culture from which you take a portion to create a levain, which is the leavening agent that leaves the starter to create the bread. The levain leaves the starter and becomes an ingredient in your bread. That's an easy way to remember it. The levain leaves you. For this video, we're focusing on the starter, how to create one, and how to manage it once it becomes strong. I recreated my starter when I moved to Ontario. Previously, when I lived in Calgary, I had used another method. I had read about and experimented with, and I'll talk about those methods as well. I continued feeding it every day for 12 days because we have seasons in Canada, and temperatures fluctuate constantly. I wanted to make sure the yeast and bacteria had become strong enough to reliably bake bread with, even in a colder environment. Around day 7, I split the starter into 2 jars so I could test one for baking while still maintaining a backup culture. If the first loaf failed, I still had enough that the mother culture had safely developed in the second jar, and I could continue feeding it until the next bake attempt. That process worked for me, and it has worked multiple times since. If you simply want to create a starter, the process itself is very straightforward. Combine roughly equal amounts of flour and water in a jar or container, cover it loosely, and leave it in a warm environment. By day 3 or 4, you should begin seeing bubbles depending on your environment. If it's cold, it might take longer. If it's warm, you could actually get activity sooner. By day 5, activity is often much stronger if you're in a warmer environment. By day 7 or 8, if you're in the colder environment. Some starters are ready to bake with by days 5, 6, or 7. If you're in a colder or fluctuating environment, you may wish to continue feeding through to day 12 to build additional strength and stability. It's very important to give the little yeasties, a chance to grow if you're in a colder environment. If you're in the warmer environment, your little yeasties are really happy. I created multiple videos showing this process because I wanted people to understand that you do not always need to be exact. If you're reasonably close to equal amounts of flour and water, fermentation will still happen. So, although a scale is a preferred method in many ways, you don't need to use the scale. One traditional method is the discard method, and it is also one that I tried. You feed the starter, discard a portion, then feed it again repeatedly over several days. For example, 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of water, let it sit 8 hours to 12 hours, discard half. Then repeat every 8 to 12 hours. 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of water, but discard half of the original first. This is a much more aggressive feeding schedule and can create a very strong starter quickly. Many people will have a starter ready to bake with by days 5 and 7 using this method as well, depending on your environment. It absolutely works, and I've done it myself. Another option is purchasing a mature culture or receiving a portion of starter from another baker. Once you begin maintaining and feeding that culture yourself, it becomes your starter. Over time, I moved away from the discard heavy method because I no longer bake every day. My current starter is 4 years old. I call her Cassie. If I take a portion of her to bake with, I call that Cassie Jr. Earlier this year, I combined her with another starter named Juno, and now the culture lives happily in my fridge and gets fed about once a week. When I'm ready to bake, I remove a small portion, usually between 25 to 50 grams, and build my levain separately. If I take 50 grams from the mother culture, from the starter, I replace that amount in the main jar with fresh flour and water before returning it to the fridge. So on a regular bake, if I take 50 grams from the mother culture, I replace that amount in the main jar with fresh flour and water before returning it to the fridge. If I know I won't be baking for a while, I increase the feeding slightly so the yeast has more food available over a longer period of time. For example, maybe I'll give it 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water in a larger jar. This method works really well in the fridge, not necessarily on the counter. If a starter sits too long without feeding, you may begin developing hooch. I've got a video on this as well. Stronger acidity or an acetone smell that comes from the starter when it hasn't been fed, that simply means the culture is hungry and needs refreshing. A little acidity is not necessarily a bad thing. Historically, sourdough cultures were often kept alive continuously with small regular feeds. Monasteries did this. Households did this. Medieval people did this. So a slight tang in the bread was completely normal. If you are maintaining a warm starter and not baking every day, you may eventually need to discard some starters simply to keep the culture balanced and manageable. My personal approach now is slower and lower waste. I keep my starter in the fridge, feed it about once a week, and build a separate levain whenever I'm ready to bake. I hope this is helpful. I'm a little yeasty, short and stout. There are other beasties hanging out. Feed us every day and discard may grow. Keep us on the counter where the warm winds blow. Feed us once a week for a slower pace. Store us in the fridge in a cooler place. Feed us cold and slow and away we go. Sleeping in the fridge down below. I actually do write children's stories. And what this does,